I work as a freelance music producer in the indie pop world, and the two bands that keep getting referenced over and over again are the 1975 and the band Camino, which is funny to me because they are two completely different bands. They sound nothing alike, and so I thought I would make a very quick guide on how I normally start out my thought process from a production standpoint when I'm making a more vintage-inspired indie pop track versus a more modern indie pop track. And the way that I'm going to show you this is by showing you this modern indie pop track that I made for fun, and then comparing it to this vintage indie pop version of it that I also made, and sort of comparing and contrasting the sound choice differences. But first thing we need to do is listen to both of them. So this is my version of more of a modern band Camino style indie pop track. And now here's my version of that same general chord progression and song idea and tempo in more of a vintage indie pop sound. Now, it's not really possible to fully compare these two bands to each other because every song they do sounds completely different. So take these more as general guidelines other than harsh rules. But the thing that I notice in a lot of modern band Camino stuff is there's this feeling of the track is just like one big chonky boy. Like all the guitars, bass, and drums, it turns into like this one big like ba 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 ba. Like everything is sort of hitting together like this insane sort of like bass cannon feel. Whereas with the 1975, you get more of the elements sort of floating in and out of one another. Some elements will line up, but they're not trying to like take over everything. It's not like every single instrument in the track is hitting on this like ba ba. There's a lot more of an interplay between the parts. Another thing you'll notice is guitar tone. If I solo all the guitar parts here for the band Camino version, a lot of the tones tend to be a bit more high gain. For a lot of these, I used Neural DSP Nolly Archetype with a little bit of Arturia Chorus before it. So this style tends to play really well with really high gain guitar tones and amps. Whereas if we look at the 1975 guitar layers, you'll most likely notice that there's a lot of sort of clean to light crunchy layers and then like one really drivey layer. Normally a lead that can just pop out on top of everything. That lead is actually running through this guitar rig preset. That's my version of the Robbers lead guitar tone. So if you want to grab this guy, I have it for free in the description. Knock yourselves out with it. Now, one thing that I stole for both of these layers is these textured pads, which is just a guitar note that I ran through this sort of granular effect. Because I do feel like a lot of these indie pop genres, they really benefit from pads that are not just like a Juno holding down a single note. They do really well with these uniquely designed pad textures that are made from like elements that are already in the song. If you want to see how I turn stuff like that into a pad, I've already made a video on that, so you can go check that out. You can also pay attention to like what the ear candy of the guitar part is. So for the 1975, it's more of these guys, which are a couple of double-tracked Nashville acoustics, which just means it's a regular acoustic, but what are normally the 4 lowest strings are an octave up, so it sounds very like 12-stringy. And I find that with 1975 inspired tracks, it works well to go for ear candy layers that almost feel like somebody in an old studio in the 80s just grabbing something off the wall and being like, well, what about this? Or going for some synthesizer and being like, well, what about this? Whereas some of the main ear candy in the band Camino track, in my mind, sounds like this. Which, if I turn off all of the effects, just sounds like this. Which is just a guitar part that I have pitched up a couple of octaves, so if I take off that octave, but then I pitch it 2 octaves up, run it through a little bit of ROM reverb, and then I throw some gate lab on it. So instead of getting this guitar part, I get almost like this synth patch that's sort of stuttering around your head. And if I just play the track without it, versus you can hear that it adds a little bit of melodic content, but also it just like adds some like stereo detail, and it feels like very modern. It's not something that you'd necessarily do if you were in like a classic 80s studio. Next thing we can talk about is synth choice. So here's the synths from the band Camino version. What I've discovered with a lot of the 1975 stuff and the band Camino stuff is a synth layer is normally either going to be the main focal point of the song, like it's like the main bit of ear candy, or it's going to be a layer that's supporting what's already happening in the track. So here, this Juno, it's basically just there to support what the guitars are doing. So if I play the synths and the guitars, if I just turn off the Juno, you can hear that the chords get a little bit thinner than when I turn it back on. There's just a little bit more meat on them. It's not a super audible layer. And then you have this little lead guy here, which I just threw into a bunch of distortion and lo-fi effects to give it this eerie piano vibe. Now let's compare that to the 1975 synth layers. So you can hear the main layer we're hearing is this keys patch, which is really grabbing our attention in the track. It's just this DX7 patch inside of Contact Retro Machines. They're meant to be like this over-the-top, like 80s layer that you can hear. There is one ear candy layer for the synths. There's this emulator too from Arturia. And similar to that guitar part, I just threw it with some reverb and gate lab and then some RC20. Like you can hear it's kind of adding that same texture that the other guitar part was adding, but it's like we're intentionally coloring it to sound older or more vintagey. RC20 can help with that a lot, but really it's about picking sounds that sound like they are synthesizers from an old studio. So your Junos, your DX7s, your Prophets. Though honestly, the more weirder vintage stuff you can find, the better. And then this guy is a synth that I recorded from my Korg mini log. Just to make it sound a little bit like Looking for Somebody to Love. But what really helps this synth pop out as like more of a vintage layer is this spring reverb. If I turn it off. And as you can see, I don't even have a crazy amount of the reverb running with this synth, but using more vintage effects like spring reverb or older versions of plate reverbs and your sound effects in general, like picking older algorithms. Like this is the main reverb that I'm using for the 1975 track, and it's on the 80s color preset, whereas on the Band Camino track, I'm mainly using more of a modern reverb. So getting really intentional about what sound effects you're using and how much coloration they're adding to the track can really help a lot. Let's go to our bass sounds. So in the Band Camino track, we have these two guys, which that was just a hyper pop style bass that I found in Massive X. I just wanted something that had a bunch of like weird texture to it, and I threw some filter and one knob pumper on top of that to complement the drums that are in that section. But then the main bass of this is really this guy here, which is a punk bass from Submission Audio running into Parallax by Neural DSP. Like we're trying to get more of like a punky tone out of our bass. We want there to be a substantial amount of grit to it so that it can cut through the mix. Or even on some of the other Band Camino songs where it's more of like a slap tone, like See You Later, we're going for a very modern version of a bass sound. We're probably going to be using something like active pickups or something else that's more of like low end heavy, a little bit more high end and sparkly. Whereas with the 1975 bass tone, we have this, which is two layers, which is this live bass. This is honestly a little bit more saturated than I would normally do for a bass of this style, but it just kind of felt right with this track. But I would say the main characteristics to pay attention to is the fact that you're not getting like that same like chunky high-end pick attack. You're getting more of this like muted top end and more of a beefier mid-range. And you're not really focusing that much on getting this sort of like insane sub-harmonic low end. And then I layered it with this bass sound. In hindsight, I'm not even really sure that it needed it, but I have noticed this as something that the 1975 will do multiple times. Their bass sound will be a mixture of a live bass and a synth bass, and they're like sort of intentionally blurring the lines with the two of them. Now we can look at the drums. So for the Band Camino, here's our drum sound. You can hear there's a very aggressive, punky vibe to it. I'm using Luke Holland mix wave for this. And yeah, I just feel like with the Band Camino stuff, you need to have like a drum tone that almost like punches through the mix. Regardless of whether you have this exact library or not, you can get it with a bunch of different libraries. But basically you need that sort of like really hard clipped, really compressed, modern, clean drum sound. Everything else is going to basically be ducking around how big your drum sound is. Like your mixing stage is going to be making sure your basses are sidechained to your kick. It's going to be your guitars sidechained to your snare. Like everything is basically going to be getting out of the way of your drums. Now in the 1975, for this track, I modeled it more off of the drum sound from the newest record, which is a little bit lighter and less compressed. If you were to go to something like the Pink and White album, you might get a little bit more of that modern compressed sound. But for their more recent records, you're going to get more of a live band vibe as a whole. It's not like a hyper slick production where everything is based around the drums. You're going more for the feel of a band in a studio playing live off of the floor. And you're using that with your reverb, but you're also using that with your drum choices. We're going for something that's a little bit more tame. I use the brushes for this one, but you see what I mean. Like we're trying to go for something that's not as completely hyper polished. Also using some vintage style compression can really bring it out if I turn it off. And then I think one of the last layers to look at is the percussion and the sound effects. So for the Band Camino, this is what we have going on. It's a little bit crazy. This is from the Sophie loop pack on Splice. But essentially, we're looking for these very modern loops that are in like this percussive realm to add speed and texture to the drum beat, because you can kind of use it as a way to cheat your drum beat playing slower than it actually is. So if I just play this drum beat here, you can hear the drum beats going da, 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 da. Like that's really the emphasis of it. And if I throw this like really crazy percussion loop underneath it, you can hear there's like little pieces that dynamically just make it feel faster. If you don't like the sound of these exact loops, I don't blame you. They're kind of wacky and out there, but I thought they were fun, so I used them for this. But yeah, look at using percussion elements as a way to sort of like fill in rhythmic elements that are not going as fast. And then just, yeah, get a really good selection of like risers and impacts that really help seal transitions and downbeats. And then if we go to the 1975, it might sound really goofy, but when I've been making 1975 inspired stuff, I feel like I've gotten the best results when I've used percussion layers specifically out of almost like a disco context. Like disco has this really awesome sort of arrangement with percussion. It's like not uncommon to have somebody who's on bongos or congas or tambourine or something like that. And the 1975, they actually tour with somebody where their full job is basically to be the percussion person. And so I think that adding these elements in the background of a drum beat like this make it sound like this. Like you can hear it's filling up the space similar to the band Camino loops, but to me this feels more like somebody is on like a percussion station, and it brings it more into, again, like a live band environment, maybe a live band that has a lot of musicians in it but still more of like a live band sound as opposed to a loop that was produced out. If I had to sum up this video in like one sentence, you're gonna be producing the band Camino as if it is this like super slick music video with like transitions and camera shots and gimbals that rotate, and it's gonna feel like a punchy comic book. And the 1975 is gonna be more of you are witnessing a live band in the 80s like the Talking Heads or Radiohead, just seeing a bunch of musicians play something cool in a live setting. So hopefully you guys found this helpful. If you have any other questions, please put them down in the comments below. But yeah, I will see you guys next week.